While scientists puzzle over important Mars questions, is there evidence of past life there? Liquid water. Some of us are left to ask more mundane questions, like was there once soup on Mars? YouTube user UFO Hunter spotted what looks like a spoon half buried in dust on the surface of the red planet. The image in question comes from NASA's Curiosity rover, which snapped it back in May. UFO Hunter shared the sighting on Tuesday, suggesting it may be left over from a lost civilization. As thrilling as that sounds, the more likely explanation is that it's an odd spoon-shaped bit of regular old Mars landscape. Humans have a propensity for assigning familiar characteristics to random objects, a phenomenon called pareidolia. This is what lets us imaginatively see sheep in clouds, and everything from a fish to Donald Trump's face on Mars. This isn't the first time a spoon-like formation has been spotted in a rover image. A gravity-defying, shadow-casting spoon popped up in late 2015. Maybe someday we'll find an entire set of silverware. The U.S. population this year grew at its lowest rate since the Great Depression, and the state of New York shrank for the first time in a decade, according to Census Bureau data released Tuesday. An uptick in deaths, a slowdown in births, and a slight drop in immigration all damped American population growth for the year ended July 1st. The 0.7% increase, to 323.1 million, was the smallest on record since 193,637, according to William Frey, a demographer at the Brookings Institution. The figures show Americans continue to leave the north for western states, with Utah, Nevada, Idaho, and several others in that region topping the country in percentage growth. Besides New York, Pennsylvania and Illinois also shrunk in notable ways, with the land of Lincoln losing more people than any other state. About 593,000 people left the Northeast and Midwest to move to the South and West this year, slightly more than during the prior one-year period, the data show. The numbers suggest that the job lock and depressed home values that kept Americans from moving 4 years after the recession are dissipating, and that immigrants who started out in these regions are moving on. New York, whose loss of 1,900 people put its population at 19.7 million, is shrinking largely because residents are leaving for other states. It has an aging population that is retiring in warmer places such as Florida, or staying put and dying. As a state that has more people leaving than going in, that is not a good thing, said Jan Vink, a researcher at Cornell University's program on applied demographics. People claim it's about the taxes, it's about the weather. There are many reasons. Utah, the fastest growing state this year, with a 2% gain, added nearly 61,000 people to lift its population to 3.1 million. Gains in technology and other jobs have led to tighter labor markets, housing shortages, and rising school enrollment, said Pamela Perlich, director of demographic research at the University of Utah's Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute. There is a new economy being created out of the carnage of the Great Recession, and in a lot of those new growth areas, Utah seems to be at the forefront, Ms. Perlich said. You roll back 40 years ago, and we were really pretty isolated, and much more parochial here. Another big gainer was Texas, whose addition of about 433,000 people accounted for 19% of the country's growth. The state, with 27.9 million people, grew from a relatively strong flow of immigrants and people relocating there from other states. 8 states lost population this year, including West Virginia, Connecticut, Vermont, Wyoming, and Mississippi. Illinois' loss of about 38,000 people, leaving it with 12.8 million, marks the third year in a row the state has shrank. North Dakota, a fast grower in recent years, saw its population barely edge up this year, as the state struggles with a slowdown in its soil industry. Among factors weighing on overall population growth is that the number of babies women are having, which plummeted in the 200,709 recession, hasn't picked up as much as demographers had expected during the recovery. The mortality rate for Americans is also creeping up, in part due to stalled progress in preventing people from dying of heart disease. The Census Bureau revised downward its estimates of immigration for each year since 2010, by an average of 10%. For this year, it estimated that 999,000 immigrants arrived, down 4% from the prior year. The Italian name for the caldera Campi Flegrei, or burning fields, is apt. The 7.5-mile-wide cauldron is the collapsed top of an ancient volcano, formed when the magma within finally blew. though half of it is obscured beneath the crystal blue waters of the Mediterranean. The other half is studded with cinder cones and calderas from smaller eruptions, and the whole area seethes with hydrothermal activity. Sulfuric acid spews from active fumaroles, geysers spout water and steam, and the ground froths with boiling mud, and earthquake swarms shudder through the region, 125 miles south of Rome, and things seem to be heating up. Writing in the journal Nature on Tuesday, scientists report that the caldera is nearing a critical point at which decreased pressure on rising magma triggers a runaway release of gas and fluid, potentially leading to an eruption. Forecasting volcanic eruptions is a famously dicey endeavor, and right now, it's impossible to say if and when Campi Flegrei might erupt, according to lead author Giovanni Chiodini, a volcanologist at the National Institute of Geophysics in Rome. But now more than ever, the caldera demands attention. An eruption would be devastating to the 500,000 people living in and around it. The site's last major eruption happened over the course of a week in 1538, when it expelled enough new material to create the cinder cone mountain Monte Nuovo. But the caldera itself is some 39,000 years old, formed by an eruption larger than anything else in the past 200,000 years of European history. A 2010 study in the journal Current Anthropology suggested that this prehistoric outburst, which spewed almost 1 trillion gallons of molten rock and released just as much sulfur into the atmosphere, set off a volcanic winter that led to the demise of the Neanderthals, who died out shortly afterward. Today, the Campi Flegrei caldera is increasingly restless. For half a century, scientists have measured bradyseism events, slow movements of the ground, that are indicative of molten rock slowly filling the mountain's magma chamber. Significant uplift in the past decade prompted Italian authorities to raise the supervolcano's alert level from green quiet to yellow scientific attention. In 2012, these areas can give rise to the only eruptions that can have global catastrophic effects comparable to major meteorite impacts. Giuseppe De Natale, head of a drilling project to monitor the caldera, told Reuters after that change was made in 2012. Now, Chiodini and his colleagues have identified the volcano's critical degassing pressure, a vital data point in understanding the likelihood of an eruption. As molten rock from the Earth's interior rises through the crust, it is subject to less pressure, and this decline in pressure causes volatile gases dissolved within it to be released. At the critical degassing pressure point, this process accelerates tenfold. Huge amounts of steam are injected into the surrounding rock. If the magma loses too much water, it may harden and cease its upward motion, stopping the eruption in its tracks. Alternatively, the injections of steam could destabilize the rock, accelerate the deformation process, and ultimately cause the volcano to blow. Chiodini said scientists have seen an increase in ground deformation and low-level seismic activity around the caldera in recent years. This pattern compares with activity seen around similar volcanoes before their eruptions. This doesn't mean residents of Naples should be heading for cover. In general, unfortunately, volcanology is not a precise science, Chiodini wrote in an email. We have many uncertainties and long-term provisions are at the moment not possible. For example, the process that we describe could evolve in both directions, toward pre-eruptive conditions, or to the finish of the volcanic unrest. What's more, volcanoes operate on timescales far beyond the scope of most scientific records. Campi Flegrei has had a major eruption only twice in the past 40,000 years, and both happened long before the invention of the first writing systems, let alone seismometers. There are written accounts of the 1538 eruption, but there are limits to the scientific insight those descriptions they provide. What they lack in data, however, they make up for in vividness. Take this recollection, written by Italian philosopher Simone Porzio. The large tract of land which lay between the foot of the mountain and the sea was seen to rise and take the form of the newly produced mountain. And on the same day, at the second hour of the night, this mount of earth opened like a mouth, with a great roaring, vomiting much fire and pumice and stones.